You are here because the state intends to place violence in your hands, not for vengeance, not for pride, but because the world is not gentle, and the law must still be obeyed. Use of force theory is not about how hard you can strike. It is about when you must, and when you must not. Every measure of force you use will be judged twice, once in the moment, by your survival, and again after, by those who were not there. The law does not ask you to be fearless. It asks you to be reasonable. You will be forced to decide in seconds whether a man is a threat, whether his hands mean death, whether mercy will get you killed. And when that moment passes, you will be expected to explain your actions clearly, calmly, and truthfully. Use of force theory exists because power without limits becomes cruelty, and hesitation without authority becomes a gravestone. You will learn when force is lawful, when force becomes excessive, and when failing to act is itself a violation of duty. Now let us cover the vocabulary words in this subject. Custody. A man is in custody when the law has placed hands on him. Custody means a person is not free to leave because lawful authority has restrained them. This includes being under arrest by a peace officer, or being physically restrained by a public servant under a court order, or being restrained inside a federal detention facility by its agents or employees. If the law has taken control of a person's movement, custody exists. Escape. Escape is choosing freedom without permission. Escape means leaving custody without authorization or failing to return after temporary approved leave, medical visit, court, work detail, etc. Escape does not include violating probation or parole rules, unless those rules required confinement in a secure facility. If a person was supposed to be held or returned, and they weren't, that is escape. Deadly force. Some force ends fights. This force ends lives. Deadly force is force that is intended to cause death or serious bodily injury, or is used in a way that is capable of causing death or serious bodily injury. Intent does not have to be spoken. If a reasonable person knows the force can kill, the law treats it as deadly. A bullet, a blade, a vehicle used as a weapon. These are not warnings. They are final measures. Habitation. A habitation is where life sleeps. A habitation is a structure or vehicle adapted for overnight accommodation of people. This includes each separately secured or occupied area, rooms, and apartments, and any connected or appurtenant structures, attached garages, connected storage. If a person lives there or sleeps there, the law gives it greater protection. Vehicle. A vehicle is movement given form. A vehicle includes any device used to move people or property in normal transportation or commerce. It does not include devices classified as habitations. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, trailers in motion. Once it becomes a place to live overnight, the law may treat it differently. Memory hook. Custody. The law has hold of you. Escape. Leaving when you're not allowed. Deadly force. Force that can end life. Habitation. Where people sleep. Vehicle. What carries people or property. Justifications for use of force. Texas Penal Code, Chapter 9. The world will ask why you used force. The law will demand an answer. In Texas, a person may use force only when the law says the conduct is justified. Justification means this: the act may look violent, but the law recognizes it as necessary and lawful. A. General justification. 1. Public duty. Texas Penal Code Section 9.21. A person's conduct is justified when the person reasonably believes the conduct is required or authorized by law, a judgment or order of a competent court, or the execution of legal process. This means, if you are carrying out lawful authority, the law may protect your action, so long as your belief was reasonable. Deadly force is not justified under this section unless a statute specifically requires it, or it occurs in lawful war. If deadly force is specifically justified this way, there is no duty to retreat. Duty does not excuse cruelty, but lawful duty does justify necessary action. 2. Necessity. Texas Penal Code Section 9.22. Conduct is justified by necessity when all three are true. The person reasonably believes the conduct is immediately necessary to avoid imminent harm. And avoiding that harm clearly outweighs, by ordinary standards of reasonableness, the harm the law was trying to prevent. And the legislature has not clearly shown that this justification is excluded. Necessity is the law's confession that sometimes you must choose the lesser evil. B. Protection of persons. 1. Self-defense. Texas Penal Code. Section 9.31. A person is justified in using force against another when, and to the degree, the person reasonably believes the force is immediately necessary to protect against the other person's use or attempted use of unlawful force. This does not justify force for verbal provocation alone, or pride, or anger. If a person is lawfully present, did not provoke the encounter, and is not committing a crime, the person is not required to retreat before using force. Self-defense is not permission to win. It is permission to survive. 2. Deadly force in defense of person. Texas Penal Code, Section 9.32. Deadly force is justified only when the person would already be justified in using force under self-defense, and the person reasonably believes deadly force is immediately necessary either to protect against another's use or attempted use of unlawful deadly force, or to prevent the other's imminent commission of certain violent crimes named in the statute. If a person is lawfully present, did not provoke, and is not committing a crime, the person is not required to retreat before using deadly force. Deadly force is not a tool. It is a last door you open when there is no other way out. 3. Defense of third person. Texas Penal Code Section 9.33. A person is justified in using force or deadly force to protect a third person when, under the circumstances as the actor reasonably believes them to be, the actor would be justified in using force or deadly force to protect himself against what he believes is threatening the third person. And the actor reasonably believes intervention is immediately necessary to protect the third person. If you stand between the innocent and violence, the law may treat their danger as your own. 4. Protection of life or health. Texas Penal Code, Section 9.34. A person may use force, but not deadly force, when the person reasonably believes it is immediately necessary to prevent another from committing suicide or inflicting serious bodily injury on himself. A person may use deadly force only when the person reasonably believes it is immediately necessary to preserve the other person's life in an emergency. Sometimes force is used not to defeat a man, but to keep him alive. C. Protection of property. 1. Protection of one's own property. Texas Penal Code, Section 9.41. A person in lawful possession of land or movable property is justified in using force when, and to the degree, the person reasonably believes the force is immediately necessary to prevent or end trespass, or prevent or end unlawful interference with property. A person unlawfully dispossessed may use force to recover property only if it is done immediately or in fresh pursuit, and the circumstances meet the statute's conditions. The law allows defense of property, but it does not bless revenge. 2. Deadly force to protect property. Texas Penal Code, Section 9.42. Deadly force may be used to protect land or property only when force would be justified under protection of property, and The person reasonably believes deadly force is immediately necessary to prevent certain serious property crimes listed in the statute, or to stop a fleeing offender immediately after certain crimes, and the person reasonably believes either the property cannot be protected or recovered by any other means, or using non-deadly force would expose someone to a substantial risk of death or serious bodily injury. Deadly force for property is lawful only when the danger around the property is greater than the property itself. 3. Protection of third person's property. Texas Penal Code Section 9.43. A person may use force or deadly force to protect another person's property if the person would be justified protecting his own property under the same rules, and the person reasonably believes theft or criminal mischief is happening or attempted, and the person has a lawful reason to intervene, such as the third person requested protection, the person has a legal duty to protect, or the third person is a close family member or under the person's care. You may defend another's property, but only when the law recognizes your right to stand in their place. 4. Use of a device to protect property. Texas Penal Code Section 9.44. The law allows the use of a device to protect land or property only if the device is not designed to cause death or serious bodily injury, and its use was reasonable under the circumstances when installed. A trap has no judgment. The law does not trust it with human life. D. Special relationships. 1. Parent and child. Texas Penal Code, Section 9.61. A parent, step-parent, or one acting in the place of a parent may use force, but not deadly force, when reasonably believed necessary to discipline a child or protect the child's welfare. 2. Educator and student. Texas Penal Code, Section 9.62. An educator or caretaker may use force, but not deadly force, when reasonably believed necessary to accomplish the purpose of supervision or maintain discipline. 3. Guardian and mentally incompetent person. Texas Penal Code Section 9.63. A guardian or responsible caretaker may use force, but not deadly force, when reasonably believed necessary to protect welfare or maintain discipline in an institution. Care gives authority, but it does not give the right to destroy. E. Custody and escape. 1. Prevention of escape from custody. Texas Penal Code, Section 9.52. Force may be used to prevent escape when the force could have been used to make the arrest under which the person is held. In a correctional facility, a guard or peace officer may use any force, including deadly force, when reasonably believed immediately necessary to prevent escape from the facility. If a violent man escapes custody, the danger does not end. It spreads. 2. Maintaining security in a correctional facility. Texas Penal Code. Section 9.53. An officer or employee of a correctional facility is justified in using force against a person in custody when reasonably believed necessary to maintain security of the facility, protect the safety or security of others in custody, protect employees, or protect oneself. Order in a cage is not cruelty. It is what prevents slaughter. Psychological aspects of the use of force. Force is not just muscle and metal. It is the mind under pressure. If your mind fails, your hands will follow. The role of law enforcement in an arrest. In a physical arrest, the police role is essentially defensive. Defensive does not mean timid. It means your purpose is to protect. It is serving to protect. It is devoted to resisting or preventing aggression or attack. Your initiative to confront a law violator is not aggression. You are not there to start a fight. You are there to stop criminality and protect the community. Here is where officers get in trouble. Problems can arise when officers use force against a combative but unarmed violator without applying reasonable alternatives. That is a test sentence. If you see those words, the idea is simple. Unarmed does not mean harmless, but unarmed often demands that you show you tried reasonable alternatives before escalating. An officer needs a range of decision-making tools that allow use of exactly the degree of control that constitutes reasonable force. That means you need options, not one response, not one mood, a scale of control, concept of control. Control is the degree of influence the officer must exert over the violator to take them safely into custody. That definition is important because it frames force as a tool for custody and safety, not punishment. Control is a two-way street. That means control is not only what you do to the violator, it is what you do to yourself. An officer must be in complete self-control to be able to control a violator. Self-control is one of the greatest assets in dealing with a law violator. Self-control results from confidence in one's skills. Self-control is achieved through training and practice, both on and off duty. And the objective of using control is to elicit violator cooperation. That last line is a test anchor. Your goal is not to win. Your goal is cooperation, so custody can happen safely. Moral considerations and forces affecting an officer's decision to use deadly force. Deadly force is not a technique. It is a moral cliff. When you step off it, you do not return unchanged. This topic is about what influences the decision. Statutory law and case law, and whether deadly force is justifiable under the circumstances presented. First influence, the law itself. The question you must ask is, can deadly force be avoided without risk of injury or death to the officer or others? That sentence is a test sentence. If you remember nothing else, remember that. Deadly force is tied to necessity and safety, not anger or fear alone. Administrative or departmental policy. Agency policy should be at least as restrictive as the law, meaning the law may allow something, but policy may restrict it further. If policy is stricter, you follow policy. Informal organizational norms. Informal norms are the unwritten culture in an agency. They may be stricter than the law or agency restrictions, or they may not. This matters because culture pressures choices. Some officers hesitate because culture punishes hesitation. Some officers rush because culture rewards aggression. The test point is simply, informal norms influence decisions, individual choice or conscience. The inner controls of the officer matter. Personal conscience can influence restraint, hesitation, or resolve. This is not saying conscience replaces law. It is saying conscience influences how you act within the law. Force options available to peace officers. You do not choose force because you want to. You choose it because you must, and because lesser tools failed. The material uses a model similar to a dynamic resistance response model. It organizes the situation by what the subject is doing and what options match it. No resistance or compliance, professional presence, verbal commands. This is the foundation. If you cannot control yourself here, you will not control anything later. Non-threatening resistance. Weaponless strategies such as takedowns, come-along holds, control holds, pressure points. This is resistance without a deadly threat. Threatening resistance. Weapon strategies including chemical or electrical means. Stun guns. Baton or impact weapons. Other personal weapons. This is where the subject's behavior creates a higher risk, and tools change accordingly. Deadly resistance, deadly force, firearms, and all tools needed to stop a deadly threat. The model's lesson is this. Match your response to the resistance. Do not stay too low and lose control. Do not go too high and become excessive. Principal considerations in applying use of force. There are two ways to fail. Too little control, and the danger grows. Too much control, and you become the danger. Ineffective control. The level of force is less than the subject's level of resistance. Result, you cannot gain control. The struggle prolongs. Risk increases for everyone. Excessive control. The level of force is unreasonably greater than the subject's level of resistance. This can cause preventable injury. This is where careers end. This is where prosecutions begin. The standard. The force used should be no more than a reasonable officer would use under the total circumstances of the situation. That is your test phrasing. Follow policy and law. Always follow departmental policy and the law. Policy may restrict you more than the law. You still follow it. Communication strategies used when dealing with the public. Most battles are won before hands are laid on anyone. Words, posture, tone, and patience. That is how you keep force from becoming necessary. Communication is an important professional skill. 97% of an officer's duties involve verbal skills. Only about 3% of contacts require physical force. That means your mouth is used far more than your hands. Elements of communication: words, touch, body movement, content, voice and tone, nonverbal behavior, raised eyebrows, posture. The message is not just what you say. It is how you stand, how you move, and how you sound. Message perception. 7% of the time a message is received due to content. 33% of the time a message is received due to voice. 60% of the time a message is received due to nonverbal and body language. This means that approximately 93% of the time a message is received and interpreted based on how something is said rather than what is said. That is test material. Memorize those numbers. Improper listening. Improper listening is not paying attention to what is said. An example is merely waiting for the opportunity to speak as soon as someone finishes talking. That is not listening. That is reloading. Communication is a professional skill, not just luck. This means it can be trained, practiced, improved, measured. Stress conditions officers must communicate under. You must communicate to people who do not want to talk or listen, to emotionally charged individuals, in dangerous circumstances, while being watched by others, to people who dislike or mistrust peace officers. Most people respond positively to reasonable requests from a peace officer. Frustrated people often resist. Upset people are often incapable of acting reasonably and will not respond to appeals of reason. Commands or orders are usually met with resistance. That last line matters. If you bark orders, expect friction. That does not mean never give orders. It means understand the reaction you're causing. Practical communication behaviors listed in the material. An officer must trust tactics which redirect behavior. Maintain disinterest. That means objectivity, free from bias, impartial. It does not mean unconcerned or mechanical. Learn to allow people to express frustration. Actively listen. Do not take things personally. This is the professional posture that prevents unnecessary force. In summary, if the exam asks you to explain these topics, your answer should hit these points. Law enforcement's role in a physical arrest is defensive and protective. Control is the influence needed to take a violator safely into custody, and it requires officer self-control. Self-control comes from training, practice, and confidence. The goal of control is cooperation. Deadly force decisions are shaped by law, policy, informal culture, and personal conscience. And deadly force should be avoided if it can be avoided without risking injury or death. Force options range from presence and verbal communication, to weaponless strategies, to weapon strategies, to deadly force, and officers must match response to resistance. Use of force fails when control is ineffective or excessive, and force must be what a reasonable officer would use under the total circumstances while following policy and law. Communication is critical because most police work is verbal. Messages are mostly received through voice and nonverbal cues, and officers must communicate under stress while actively listening, staying impartial, redirecting behavior, and not taking things personally. Elements that an officer must recognize and control in every encounter. Before hands move, before tools are chosen, an officer must recognize and control certain elements in every encounter. If these elements are ignored, force becomes more likely. If they are managed, force often becomes unnecessary. The first element is the problem. An officer must analyze and identify the problem. This means understanding what is actually happening, not what it looks like at first glance. The problem may be criminal, it may be emotional, it may be medical, it may be a misunderstanding. Identifying the problem allows the officer to plan an approach. Without a plan, actions become reactions. Reactions increase danger. The officer must remember that problems often change as a confrontation progresses. What began as a conversation may become resistance. What began as resistance may become compliance. An officer must continuously reassess. The second element is the audience. Everyone encountered is part of the audience. This includes the violator, friends, family, bystanders, witnesses, people recording with phones. The audience reacts. Some are receptive, some are hostile, some are critical. An officer must read the audience and adapt tactics appropriately. The same words spoken to one audience may calm the situation. Spoken to another, they may inflame it. If an individual has a friend in the audience, it may be helpful to enlist that person's help. A calm friend can sometimes reason with a violator when authority cannot. This is not weakness, it is strategy. The third element is constraints. Constraints are obstacles to effective communication. An officer must determine whether constraints exist, and if possible, eliminate them. Examples of constraints include time of day. Darkness changes perception and fear. Weather, heat, cold, rain, and wind affect patience and clarity. Location. Tight spaces, traffic, crowds, or confined areas increase stress. External noise, sirens, traffic, crowds, or machinery interfere with communication. The officer's own mood. Fatigue, frustration, or anger can poison judgment. The individual's values and beliefs, what the officer sees as reasonable, may not align with the subject's worldview. Signs the individual is under the influence. Alcohol or drugs reduce comprehension and impulse control. Signs of physical or mental disability. Pain, fear, confusion, or illness may drive behavior, not defiance. Constraints do not excuse behavior, but they explain it. Ignoring constraints leads to escalation. The final element is ethical presence. Ethical presence is an expression of self-control. It is how authority is carried, not how loudly it is announced. An officer must use words to state purpose, not to express personal feelings. I need you to step back is purpose. I am tired of you is emotion. Emotion weakens authority. Purpose strengthens it. The officer must maintain a professional attitude. Professional does not mean cold, it means controlled. Behavior perceived as hasty, irrational, or unfair makes an officer appear unethical. Once an officer appears unethical, compliance drops and resistance rises. Ethical presence keeps encounters lawful, controlled, and defensible. In summary, in every encounter, an officer must recognize and control the problem, the audience, the constraints, ethical presence, problem. Identify what is actually happening so the officer can plan an approach. The problem may change as the encounter progresses. Audience. Everyone present affects the encounter. Officers must read reactions and adjust tactics accordingly. Constraints. Factors that interfere with communication or control, such as environment, emotions, beliefs, impairment, or disability. Officers should recognize and reduce constraints when possible. Ethical presence. The officer's self-control, professionalism, and purpose-driven communication. Unethical behavior increases resistance and undermines authority. These elements shape communication. Communication shapes cooperation. Cooperation reduces force. Best practices in redirecting someone's behavior using verbal persuasion. The first step is to listen. Listening is not waiting to talk. Listening is working to understand. An officer must differentiate the real problem from the symptoms of the problem. Anger may be a symptom. Loud behavior may be a symptom. Resistance may be a symptom. The real problem might be fear, confusion, loss, intoxication, or frustration. Listening establishes what priorities the officer must respond to first. Safety comes before compliance. Clarity comes before control. Listening also determines the context of the event. Context explains why the behavior is happening now, in this place, with these people. Without context, officers guess. Guessing leads to mistakes. The second step is to empathize. Empathy does not mean agreement. It means understanding. The officer must understand the other person's state of mind. Fear sounds different than anger. Grief behaves differently than defiance. Seeing through the eyes of the other person allows the officer to adjust tone, pace, and words. Empathy lowers emotional temperature. Lower emotion increases cooperation. The third step is to ask questions. Questions are tools of control. When a person answers questions, they are reporting to the officer. Questions direct attention away from the problem behavior and toward thinking. Thinking slows reactions. Slower reactions reduce violence. Questions also buy time. Time allows backup to arrive. Time allows emotions to settle. Time allows better decisions. Questions demonstrate concern. Concern builds legitimacy. Legitimacy builds compliance. The fourth step is to paraphrase. Paraphrasing means repeating what you have learned in your own words. This confirms that the officer understands the situation correctly. It also forces the individual to stop talking and listen. When a person hears their own words reflected back, tension often decreases. Paraphrasing prevents misunderstanding before it becomes conflict. The fifth step is to summarize. Summarizing means clearly stating the resolution. This is where the officer provides the bottom line. It allows the officer to conclude the situation without confusion. A clear summary replaces uncertainty with direction. People resist confusion. They comply with clarity. Verbal persuasion also involves choosing the right type of appeal. One type is an ethical appeal. An ethical appeal is based on the officer's position as a professional authority. It reassures people that the officer is fair, calm, and seeking a positive outcome. This appeal is useful when dealing with upset or highly emotional individuals. Another type is a rational appeal. A rational appeal is based on reasoning. It appeals to common sense, good judgment, and community standards. It shows that the solution is reasonable and likely to work. This appeal is valuable with people who believe strongly in right and wrong. Another type is a practical appeal. A practical appeal is based on an urgent need to change a particular circumstance. It focuses on immediate outcomes, not long-term consequences. It is a short-term solution. This appeal allows the officer to adapt to the person's beliefs and persuade them through shared priorities. Another type is a personal appeal. A personal appeal addresses an individual's needs and desires. It requires the officer to set aside personal values and focus on what matters to the person. It is useful with headstrong individuals who insist on getting their own way. There are times when words are not effective. When a person seriously threatens bodily harm to an officer or the public, control is compromised. Sometimes a person combines aggressive words with aggressive actions. Words and gestures alone are not an attack, but they can signal one. Sometimes words suggest compliance while actions suggest danger. When words and actions disagree, trust actions. Actions may also be misleading, but disagreement between words and actions requires alertness and readiness to use force. Words are not effective when a suspect begins walking or running away or escapes from custody. Words are not effective when an officer is forced to repeat the same instructions. Repetition without compliance means persuasion has failed. Repeated refusal to comply with a reasonable request means more than words are required. When a person remains unreceptive after repeated verbal appeals, escalation may be necessary. Verbal persuasion is not weakness. It is discipline. It is control without injury, authority without cruelty, force avoided when possible. When words fail, force may follow. But when words succeed, force never has to arrive. In summary, the verbal persuasion framework is: listen, empathize, ask, paraphrase, summarize. Listen. Differentiate the real problem from the symptoms. Establish priorities the officer must respond to. Determine the context of the event. Empathize. Understand the other person's state of mind. See through the eyes of the other person. ASK. Use questions to gain control by causing others to report to you. Direct attention away from the problem. Buy time. Demonstrate concern. Paraphrase. Repeat what you learned in your own words. Force the individual to stop talking and listen. Ensure the officer accurately understands the situation. Summarize. State the resolution clearly. Conclude the situation. Provide the bottom line. Types of verbal appeals: ethical appeal, rational appeal, practical appeal, personal appeal. Ethical appeal, based on professional authority, reassures others, shows desire for positive outcome, useful with emotional individuals. Rational appeal, based on reasoning, appeals to common sense and judgment, shows solution is reasonable and effective, useful with strong right and wrong thinkers. Practical appeal, based on urgent need, based on beliefs and values, ignores long-term consequences. Short-term solution, allows adaptation to similarities. Personal appeal, addresses individual needs and desires. Officer sets aside personal values, useful with headstrong individuals. Ultra-short memory chain, verbal persuasion framework. Listen, empathize, ask, paraphrase, summarize. Types of verbal appeals: ethical, rational, practical, personal. Now let's address circumstances unique to stressful crime scenes in domestic settings. Domestic calls are not ordinary calls. They are personal. They are emotional. They are volatile. Use of force decisions in these situations require good judgment and strong discretion skills. Mistakes here escalate quickly. Assumptions here get people hurt. Recent Violence Against Women Act legislation has helped provide peace officers with more detailed guidance when assessing and responding to domestic violence and assault calls. The purpose of this guidance is clarity. It exists to help officers recognize patterns of abuse, risk factors, and warning signs without replacing judgment. The law provides structure. The officer provides discernment. Although most officer judgment and discretion relies on verbal skills to de-escalate situations, research shows that domestic violence calls are among the most dangerous calls officers respond to. This is critical to remember. High emotion, close quarters, history of violence, unpredictable escalation. Words are essential, but readiness for force must remain. Most domestic violence calls involve two subjects providing contradicting narratives about an event that cannot be immediately verified. Each person tells a story. Each story conflicts. The officer must not assume truth based on emotion, appearance, or gender. The officer must not assume that a female caller is automatically the victim, or that a male subject is automatically the offender. Assumptions replace investigation. Assumptions destroy credibility. The goals at a domestic violence scene are specific. First, establish whether the facts connect and whether the stories line up. This requires listening, observation, and patience. Second, protect the victim and hold the correct person accountable. Protection comes before resolution. Safety comes before closure. Third, achieve these goals while maintaining both officer safety and victim safety. This is often difficult. Separating parties, controlling emotions, and maintaining command while showing empathy requires discipline. Domestic violence scenes test everything an officer has learned: communication, control, judgment, self-restraint, awareness. Force may be necessary, but it must never be driven by assumptions. Recognize criteria relating to a professional peace officer's use of force. Professionalism is not the absence of force. It is the disciplined use of it. This section explains how professionalism is judged when a peace officer uses force. It focuses on judgment, control, and the ability to explain decisions. A professional peace officer employs theoretical knowledge under constantly changing and unpredictable circumstances. A professional peace officer applies training and theory in real situations. The street is unpredictable. People change behavior suddenly. Threats appear and disappear. Information is incomplete. Professionalism is the ability to apply training even when conditions are unstable. The officer does not freeze. The officer does not overreact. The officer adapts while remaining controlled. B. Criteria for assessing whether a peace officer is acting professionally. The following numbered criteria are used to assess professionalism during a use-of-force encounter. 1. Ability to communicate effectively with individuals outside the professional field. A professional officer communicates clearly with the public. The officer avoids technical language and police jargon. Instructions are clear. Tone is calm but firm. Words reduce confusion rather than create it. Effective communication increases compliance and reduces the need for force. 2. Ability to accurately assess the situation and define the problem. A professional officer identifies the real issue. Not every loud person is dangerous. Not every quiet person is safe. The officer determines whether the problem is criminal behavior, emotional distress, intoxication, mental crisis, medical emergency, or a combination. Correctly defining the problem guides the correct response. Misidentifying the problem leads to unnecessary or ineffective force. 3. Ability to know when to move from words to force. A professional officer understands that there is no single rule for when to transition from words to force. The decision depends on safety, behavior, and threat level. Professionals do not delay until control is lost. Professionals do not escalate out of frustration. They act when verbal control is no longer effective and safety is at risk. 4. Professional use of force is selective. Selective force means the officer chooses the type and amount of force needed. The officer matches force to resistance. The officer does not use force out of anger or pride. The goal is control, not domination. 5. Professional use of force is appropriate. Appropriate force is controlled and purposeful. The officer acts deliberately. The officer avoids unnecessary strikes or techniques. Force is used to achieve a lawful objective, such as safety or custody. Punishment, retaliation, or humiliation are never professional. 6. Ability to return to words and verbal strategies once the threat is over. A professional officer stops using force when the threat ends. Once control is achieved, the officer returns to verbal direction and explanation. This demonstrates discipline and restraint. Continued force after control is unprofessional and unlawful. 7. Knowledge to recognize indicators of impairment or disability. A professional officer recognizes that resistance may be caused by intoxication, mental illness, physical disability, or medical crisis. These indicators affect communication, expectations, and tactics. Recognizing impairment prevents unnecessary escalation and increases safety. 8. Ability to self-evaluate performance. A professional officer reviews actions honestly. The officer considers what worked, what failed, and what could improve. Self-evaluation leads to better judgment in future encounters. 9. Capability of describing and characterizing personal performance to supervisors. A professional officer can clearly explain actions after the incident. The officer explains what happened, why decisions were made, and why force was used or not used. Clear articulation protects the officer and the agency. 10. Conscious competence in decision-making. A professional officer acts with awareness. The officer understands the reasons for actions at the time they are taken, not just afterward. This awareness allows lawful, defensible, and controlled use of force. Core takeaway for criteria relating to a professional peace officer's use of force. Professional use of force requires clear communication, accurate assessment, proper timing, selective and appropriate force, return to verbal control, recognition of impairment or disability, self-evaluation, clear articulation, conscious competence. Identify typical procedures following an officer-involved shooting. This section explains what happens after an officer-involved shooting, who investigates, and what legal rules control those investigations. The most important idea to remember is this: every department has its own procedures, and the officer must follow them. However, certain court cases and Texas laws apply regardless of the department. 1. Garrity v. New Jersey. What Garrity established, a public employee, including a peace officer, cannot be forced to choose between keeping their job and giving up their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Practical meaning: officers may be compelled to answer questions in an administrative investigation. Those compelled statements cannot be used against the officer in a criminal trial. This is why many departments conduct separate investigations. 2. Texas Government Code, Chapter 614, Sections 614.021, 614.022, and 614.023. These sections control how disciplinary complaints against peace officers are handled. They exist to protect due process and fairness. Key requirements. Complaints used for discipline must be in writing. Complaints must be signed by the person making them. A copy of the complaint must be provided to the officer before discipline. These laws prevent anonymous discipline, secret accusations, surprise punishment. They apply during administrative investigations following a use of force incident. 3rd Guthrie v. Taylor. This case reinforces the importance of following Texas Government Code, Chapter 614 procedures. It teaches that departments must follow statutory complaint and notice rules. Failure to follow these procedures can invalidate discipline. This case emphasizes process matters, even in serious incidents. 4. City of Seagoville v. Little. This case further clarifies how civil service rules apply to officer discipline. The limits of remedies when procedures are not followed. It reinforces that agencies must follow established legal procedures. Officer discipline must comply with statutory requirements. 5. Local Government Code, Chapter 143. This chapter applies to civil service police departments. It governs disciplinary actions, appeals, hearings, officer rights. If an agency is a civil service city, Chapter 143 procedures apply. 6. Local Government Code, Chapter 158. This chapter applies to sheriff's civil service systems. It governs similar matters as Chapter 143, but applies specifically to sheriff's offices. C. Internal Affairs and Administrative Investigations. After an officer-involved shooting, agencies often conduct more than one investigation. 1. Criminal investigation. Purpose: determine whether a crime occurred. Who conducts it? Outside law enforcement agency. Special Investigative Unit. Prosecutor-directed investigators. Key rules: the officer cannot be compelled to give a statement. Any statement must be voluntary. Constitutional protections apply. Second Administrative Investigation. Purpose: determine policy compliance. Determine training issues. Determine discipline. Who conducts it? Internal Affairs. Professional Standards Unit. The officer's department or designee. Key rules: officers may be compelled to answer questions. Officers may be required to answer questions, participate in a lineup, take a polygraph examination. If warned of consequences and the officer refuses, discipline may occur, or they may be fired. Third Garrity protection during administrative investigations. Under Garrity, compelled administrative statements cannot be used in criminal court. Any information derived from those statements is also protected. If investigators want to use statements criminally, the officer must receive a criminal warning. Statements must be voluntary. This separation protects both officer constitutional rights, the integrity of criminal prosecutions. 4. Texas statutes provide investigation guidelines. Texas law provides structure for how investigations are conducted, how complaints are handled, how discipline is imposed. Officers are expected to know their department's policy, understand the difference between criminal and administrative investigations, identify possible consequences from excessive use of force. Excessive use of force can lead to serious consequences beyond department discipline. These consequences can include federal criminal charges, state criminal charges, federal investigation, loss of career and freedom. This section focuses on criminal civil rights consequences. 1. Federal consequences. When excessive force violates a person's civil rights, federal criminal law may apply. Federal law focuses on whether the officer used official authority, acted willfully, caused injury or death. 2 major federal offenses apply. Conspiracy against rights of citizens. What this offense is: conspiracy against rights of citizens occurs when 2 or more people work together to violate someone's constitutional or legal rights. In use of force cases, this can include agreeing to use unlawful force, coordinating abuse of authority, working together to cover up a civil rights violation. The key element is agreement, punishment for conspiracy against rights of citizens. If no bodily injury occurs, punishable by a fine and up to 10 years in federal prison. If bodily injury occurs, punishable by a fine and up to life in federal prison. If death occurs, punishable by life imprisonment or the death penalty. Important memory point: when injury or death occurs, punishment becomes extremely severe. Deprivation of rights under color of law. What this offense is: deprivation of rights under color of law occurs when a person using official authority willfully violates someone's civil rights. Under color of law means acting as a peace officer, using badge, uniform, custody, or official power. This is the most common federal charge in excessive force cases. The conduct must be willful, not accidental. Punishment for deprivation of rights under color of law. If no bodily injury occurs, punishable by a fine and up to 1 year in federal prison. If bodily injury occurs or a dangerous weapon is used, punishable by a fine and up to 10 years in federal prison. If serious bodily injury occurs, punishable by a fine and up to life in federal prison. If death occurs, punishable by life imprisonment or the death penalty. Memory anchor. Punishment increases as harm increases. Violation of civil rights of a person in custody. What this offense is: violation of the civil rights of a person in custody occurs when a public servant abuses authority over someone who is already in custody. People in custody are under state control and legally protected from abuse. This offense applies when force or mistreatment violates those protections. Punishment for violation of civil rights of a person in custody. Base offense: punishable as a Class A misdemeanor. If serious bodily injury occurs, punishable as a 3rd-degree felony. If death occurs, punishable as a 2nd-degree felony. Memory anchor. Custody abuse escalates from misdemeanor to felony based on harm. Federal investigation of civil rights violations. Federal civil rights complaints are investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation receives complaints, conducts investigations, presents appropriate cases to federal prosecutors or grand juries. Not every complaint leads to prosecution, but excessive force can trigger federal review. How federal authorities decide which cases to pursue. Federal authorities focus on misconduct, that is, clearly offensive, deliberate, willful. They generally do not focus on accidents, simple mistakes, split-second decisions made in good faith. Intentional misuse of force is the priority. Effect of agency action. If a law enforcement agency takes swift and decisive action to address misconduct, federal authorities may allow the administrative process to proceed first. This is not immunity. It does not erase criminal liability. It may affect prosecutorial discretion. No good faith defense for criminal civil rights violations. Good faith alone is not a defense to criminal civil rights violations. An officer cannot avoid criminal liability simply by claiming, "I thought I was doing the right thing." If the elements of the offense are met, criminal responsibility remains. Overall consequences of excessive use of force. Excessive use of force can result in administrative discipline, state criminal charges, federal criminal charges, federal investigation, permanent loss of career. Define crew resource management. Crew resource management, often called CRM, is a management and decision-making model. It exists to reduce human error in high-risk situations where mistakes can cause serious injury, death, or catastrophic outcomes. CRM recognizes one hard truth. Even highly trained professionals make mistakes under stress. What crew resource management is. Crew resource management is a system that gives every crew member an active voice, encourages open communication, reduces mistakes caused by authority, stress, or tunnel vision, uses all available people, information, and tools to make better decisions. CRM is not about rank being ignored. It is about information being shared. Authority still exists. Command still exists. But silence is removed. Why crew resource management exists. CRM was created after repeated disasters showed the same pattern. One person had critical information. That person did not speak up, or they spoke up, but were ignored. The mistake continued. People died. The problem was not lack of skill. The problem was human factors. These include stress, fatigue, fear of challenging authority, assumptions, poor communication. CRM exists to break that chain. Core principle of crew resource management. The core principle is simple. Any team member who sees a problem has a duty to speak up, and leadership has a duty to listen. This applies when the risk is high, the situation is rapidly changing, the cost of error is severe. Benefits of using crew resource management. Crew resource management is a practical system used in real-world, high-stress situations. It helps teams think clearly, control emotion, and prevent mistakes. 1. Crew resource management is a practical tool for real-world situations. Crew resource management is not theory alone. It gives officers a structure for communication. It provides a method to share concerns. It helps slow dangerous situations. Slowing a scene allows reason to replace impulse. 2. Crew resource management supports the duty to intervene. Crew resource management creates an expectation that team members speak up. Silence is discouraged. Intervention is normalized. 3. Speaking up slows the scene and restores rational thinking. When concerns are addressed early, the pace slows, tunnel vision decreases, emotion loses control. This reduces unnecessary escalation. 4. Peace officers are human and affected by emotion. Officers experience stress, fatigue, frustration, and anger. These emotions affect judgment if unchecked. Crew resource management exists because emotion is real. 5. Personal stress can lower tolerance. Officers may carry stress into work. Examples include family problems, lack of sleep, financial pressure, health issues. These reduce patience during chaotic calls. 6. Frustration with uncooperative subjects can build. Repeated noncompliance increases frustration. Frustration can raise voice and tone. Frustration can shorten patience. 7. Frustration can carry from one scene to the next. Stress does not always reset between calls. An officer may arrive already emotionally taxed. Crew input helps reset perspective. 8. Preconceived expectations can affect judgment. Officers may expect behavior based on past encounters. These expectations may be wrong. Crew members help challenge assumptions. 9. Anger can arise from witnessing horrific acts. Serious injury, abuse, or death can trigger anger. Without intervention, anger can escalate force. 10. Team members help regulate emotion. Crew resource management relies on partners watching each other. Partners often see emotional changes first. 11. Warning signs of emotional escalation. Partners may observe raised voice, heavy breathing, flushed skin, clenched fists, threatening language. These are cues to intervene. 12. Crew resource management allows early intervention. A team member can redirect attention, suggest slowing down, offer alternatives, call for support. Early intervention prevents regret. 13. Crew resource management improves communication. Communication improves between partners, supervisors, specialized units, outside resources. Information moves faster and clearer.
14. Crew resource management increases accountability.
When everyone speaks, everyone shares responsibility. Decisions are visible. Actions are justified. Accountability protects everyone. 15. Crew resource management reduces emotional reactions. Involvement reduces emotional escalation. People calm down when heard. 16. People support what they help create. When officers contribute to decisions, commitment increases. Team cohesion strengthens. 17. A voice creates ownership and motivation. Having a voice builds responsibility. Responsibility builds discipline. Discipline improves outcomes. Factors used by the courts to determine excessive force. This section explains how courts decide whether force used by a peace officer was reasonable or excessive. The key idea is this: courts do not judge force based on outcomes alone. They judge force based on reasonableness under the circumstances. 1. Officers can be held personally liable for excessive force. Courts recognize that peace officers are responsible for their own actions. If force is ruled excessive, the officer may face civil liability. The officer may face criminal consequences. The officer may face career-ending discipline. Personal liability means, I was doing my job, is not enough if the force was unreasonable. This is why decision-making matters. 2. Reasonable force may be used when an officer has probable cause to arrest. Courts allow officers to use reasonable force to make a lawful arrest. Probable cause matters. If an officer does not have probable cause, the arrest may be unlawful. Any force used may also be unlawful. Even with probable cause, force must still be reasonable. Probable cause allows force. It does not justify unlimited force. 3rd, the Fourth Amendment limits the level of force to what is reasonable. Courts evaluate excessive force under the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable seizures. An arrest is a seizure. Force used during an arrest is part of that seizure. The standard is not perfection. The standard is reasonableness. Courts ask, would a reasonable officer have acted the same way under the same conditions? 4. Reasonableness is based on the specific facts and circumstances. Courts do not judge force in a vacuum. They look at what the officer knew at the time, what the officer saw, what the officer reasonably believed. Courts do not judge force using hindsight. They judge force based on what was known in that moment, not what was learned later. Every case is fact-specific. 5. Courts evaluate the need for force and available alternatives. Courts consider whether force was necessary. They ask, was force needed at all? Was a lesser level of force available? Was time available to use alternatives? This does not mean officers must use the least force possible. It means force must be reasonable, given time, threat level, resistance, officer safety. If alternatives were clearly feasible and ignored, courts may view force as excessive. 6. Courts evaluate the extent of injury inflicted. The level of injury matters. Serious injury may suggest excessive force. Minor or no injury does not automatically mean force was reasonable. Courts consider type of injury, severity of injury, how the injury occurred. Injury is one factor, not the only factor. Summary. Foundations of use of force. Use of force is never punishment. It exists to gain control, protect life, and accomplish lawful objectives. Force must always be reasonable, necessary, and proportional to the situation. Officers are judged on their decisions, not simply on outcomes. Legal framework for use of force. Justification is a defense to prosecution when force is used lawfully. Force is only justified when it fits within the law. Threats of force are allowed when the use of force itself would be lawful. Recklessly injuring or killing an innocent third person is never justified. Even when force is criminally justified, civil liability may still exist. General justifications. Public duty allows force when an officer reasonably believes it is required or authorized by law or legal process. Deadly force is not justified under public duty unless specifically authorized by law. Necessity allows force when it is immediately required to prevent imminent harm, and the harm avoided outweighs the harm caused. Protection of persons. Self-defense allows force when immediately necessary to stop unlawful force. Deadly force is justified only to stop unlawful deadly force or to prevent specific violent crimes such as murder, aggravated sexual assault, robbery, or kidnapping. Defense of a third person follows the same rules as self-defense. Protection of life or health allows force to stop suicide or serious self-harm, and deadly force only when necessary to preserve life in an emergency. Protection of property. Force may be used to stop trespass or unlawful interference with property. Deadly force to protect property is strictly limited and only allowed in narrow circumstances, such as certain nighttime crimes, when no other reasonable means exist. Devices used to protect property must not create a substantial risk of death or serious injury. Law enforcement use of force. Officers may use reasonable force to make a lawful arrest or prevent escape. Deadly force during arrest is justified only when the suspect has used or attempted deadly force, or when delaying arrest creates a substantial risk of death or serious injury. There is no duty to retreat when officers act lawfully. Psychological aspects of use of force. Arrests are both physical and emotional events. The police role is defensive, not aggressive. Control is the degree of influence needed to safely take a person into custody. Control requires officer self-control. Unmanaged emotions such as fear, frustration, uncertainty, or anger can lead to hesitation, verbal abuse, bluffing, or unnecessary force. Professional awareness reduces conflict. Moral and ethical considerations. Officers must consider the law, department policy, organizational culture, and personal conscience. The key moral question is whether deadly force can be avoided without risking lives. Force options and alternatives. Presence and verbal commands are preferred whenever possible. Weaponless strategies include control holds and takedowns. Weapon strategies include chemical agents, electrical weapons, and impact weapons. Deadly force is the highest and most restricted option. Applying use of force. Ineffective control occurs when force is too low to manage resistance. Excessive control occurs when force exceeds what is reasonable. Force must match resistance and the totality of circumstances. Officers must follow both the law and departmental policy. Communication and de-escalation. Most police encounters rely on verbal communication. Only a small percentage require physical force. People respond more to tone, posture, and body language than words alone. Officers must listen, remain objective, allow people to express frustration, and avoid taking behavior personally. Encounter management. Officers must identify the problem, recognize the audience, account for constraints, and maintain ethical presence. Crowds influence behavior. Environmental and emotional factors affect communication. Professional demeanor builds legitimacy. Verbal persuasion. Effective persuasion follows a pattern. Listen, empathize, ask questions, paraphrase, and summarize. Ethical appeals rely on professionalism and reassurance. Rational appeals rely on logic and common sense. Practical appeals focus on immediate needs. Personal appeals address individual desires. Words are not effective when threats escalate, suspects flee, or repeated refusal occurs. When words fail, force may be necessary. Domestic violence considerations. Domestic violence calls are among the most dangerous. Officers must avoid assumptions and stereotypes. Conflicting narratives are common. Goals include determining facts, protecting victims, holding the correct person accountable, and maintaining officer safety. Professional use of force criteria. Professional officers communicate clearly, define problems accurately, and know when to move from words to force. Force is selective, appropriate, controlled, and purposeful. Professionals return to verbal control once threats end. They recognize impairment or disability, self-evaluate performance, and articulate actions clearly. Officer-involved shootings. Departments follow specific procedures. Criminal and administrative investigations are often separate. Compelled administrative statements are protected and not admissible in criminal court. Criminal statements require constitutional warnings. Texas law requires written and signed complaints for discipline. Consequences of excessive force. Excessive force may result in administrative discipline, state criminal charges, federal charges, and federal investigations. Federal offenses include conspiracy against civil rights and deprivation of rights under color of law. Texas offenses include violation of civil rights of a person in custody. Severity of punishment increases with injury or death. Good faith is not a defense to criminal civil rights violations. Crew resource management. Crew resource management gives every team member a voice. It reduces human error in high-risk situations and supports the duty to intervene. Team members help regulate stress and emotion. Warning signs include raised voice, heavy breathing, clenched fists, and threatening language. Benefits of crew resource management. CRM slows scenes and restores rational thinking. It improves communication, accountability, and outcomes. People support what they help create. Court evaluation of excessive force. Courts evaluate reasonableness under the Fourth Amendment. Officers may be personally liable. Courts consider what the officer knew at the time, the need for force, available alternatives, and the extent of injury. Hindsight is not the standard.